Welcome back to CEEN Caribbean News. It's time to go in depth. On Monday, St Lucians voted overwhelmingly for the replacement of the St Lucia Labour Party administration led by three-term Prime Minister Dr. Kenny Anthony with the United Workers' Party and its leader Alan Chastany. When the ballots were counted, the St Lucia Labour Party lost 5 of its seats to the United Workers' Party, giving the UWP a 5-seat majority in the 17-member parliament. We're being joined by Regional Pollster and Director of the Caribbean Development Research Services, CADRES, Peter Wickham, who has his ears to the ground in St Lucia. Welcome to In Depth, Mr. Wickham. Let's begin here. You called yet another election right with the St Lucia polls, cementing your credibility as a pollster to be reckoned with in the region. What were the main findings of your recent survey that indicated a fill-up for the UWP?
Okay, well, thank you for the support, and yes, I agree the poll that we did was indicative of what was likely to happen. I think the most important indicator was the swing that we saw. We saw the swing at 2%, and it was about 3 weeks ago, and that was what we reported on. But the significant thing in the poll, however, was that the comparative to the previous October, that we had done another poll that showed significant improvements in the popularity of Mr. Alan Chastany, and also a significant increase in the desire of St. Lucians to change. It was against that background that we concluded that there was a momentum that was clearly in favor of the UWP. We did constituency-based polls over the period of the week preceding the election in 5 constituencies that we thought would be the ones that are likely to move. We felt that the 6 that they held, they would continue to hold, and that there were 5 that they could penetrate. The polls suggested that they would have succeeded in all 5 of them, and they actually have succeeded in all 5 of them. So I think there was a desire for change, and there was also a warming up to the St. Lucia, the UWP. Those would have been the main factors that I saw in terms of what made a difference in the outcome of this election.
Elections in May, former Prime Minister Dr. Kenny Anthony said he was giving the UWP what they had been calling for all along. But was this one of the first set of indicators that the governing SLP was in trouble?
Yeah, I certainly think so. They were certainly not going to admit this, but my sense is that the St. Lucia Labour Party probably did some polling of their own, and they identified that it was slippage. Certainly my own reading of the situation, when I compare October, when I did my own poll, to the situation when the election was called, there clearly was slippage. My sense is that the St. Lucia Labour Party read that, and contrary to what they were saying that their polls were telling them, I really think the reality was that they understood that they were losing ground. And they were losing ground simply because the UWP was organizing. The UWP was dealing with the main issue of unity. I think the SLP assumed that they could run an election on the unelectability of the UWP. And guess what? The UWP demonstrated the extent to which they were electable, and the whole conversation changed.
There were media reports about heavy rainfall on the ground in St. Lucia on Monday, and sometimes political parties may ascribe some of the blame for low voter turnout to the weather. Is there any leeway here for the SLP to draw for this excuse, or the results as we know it were going to be the case no matter what?
Yeah, no, you're very right that the rainfall could have been a factor. My sense is that this would have been the outcome anyhow. It is possible that because of the rain, St. Lucia's supporters of the St. Lucia Labour Party couldn't be bothered to go and vote in a situation where they weren't natural with the party anyhow. But the reduction in voter turnout was about 55%. The reduction over 2011 was a 4% reduction. But it's interesting that the reduction over 2006 and 2011 was also 3%. So while I do agree that it could have been a factor that helped the UWP to win, it was also a factor that was similar. There were similar decreases in 2011, and in that instance, the St. Lucia Labour Party won. So I don't know that the reduction in the voter turnout was necessarily, or the rain was necessarily an impact on the reduction in voter turnout, because we had a similar reduction in 2011, and there was no reported avalanche of rain in that year. My sense is that it didn't make a huge difference. So this is what would have happened.
I'm sure you've been doing post-election canvassing. What has been the reaction of stakeholders on the ground in St. Lucia to the change in political administration?
Yeah, no, I think people were looking for it. St. Lucia wanted an opportunity to breathe. The feeling that I got in my polls is that people were tired of change, and they were also tired of the fact that unemployment was stagnant at 20%. It had gone from 20% to 25% by the end of the Anthony term. And people felt that something needed to happen and nothing was happening. I think this is a breath of fresh air for what it is worth. I mean, it may very well not work out, or it might work out very well. But at the same time, I think that people are satisfied in the private and the public sector that, you know, the situation for right now is at least there's a little bit of hope, where before there appeared not to have been much. Mr. Alan Chastanet, remember, is a private sector person in and of himself. So my expectation is that he would probably get along well in those circles because most of them are familiar with him as a business person.
First, go in the top seat for Mr. Chastanet, who, as it happened, was very emotional at his swearing-in ceremony on Tuesday. He pinpointed the revival of the economy via the banana sector, hotel investments, and job creation as his main focus, even extending the arm of cooperation to the opposition. What type of leadership do you expect from Mr. Chastanet, bearing in mind his private sector experience, and what should be his main areas of focus?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very important question. Generally, we find that private sector people are less populist and more focused on what we could call a technocratic approach to government. My sense is that he will be a slightly more technocratic leader and less populist than Dr. Anthony. Dr. Anthony had a tendency to be very academic in his approach to political discourse and also his approach to political decision-making. I believe that Mr. Alan Chastanet will have very little of that, and that he will be more practical, more hands-on, and he will attempt to deal with the fundamental issues of the economy and unemployment frontally. I mean, his first statement, press conference that he held within hours of winning the election, indicated that, you know, he would deal with the issue of bananas, the agricultural sector, the economy. They proposed to do stuff with VAT, to roll it back initially and then replace it with a sales tax. And all of these things he's talking about, you know, within minutes of winning an election, which says to me that he's inclined to get down to work, and he wants to get down to work soon to deal with the main issues that I identified.
Now, in the area of crime, which is a concern of Mr. Chastanet, including the investigation into the allegations of extrajudicial killings committed by the police, which has impacted relations with the U.S., how would Prime Minister Chastanet approach this issue?
Yeah, I mean, he was very clear in the election campaign on how he proposed to deal with it, and his position was he would deal with it from the perspective of action, that he would act on recommendations and he would act on them quickly. I don't think that anyone is really quite sure what was the reason that Dr. Anthony was taking so long to act, you know, in that matter. What was his logic behind procrastinating so much? But certainly the reaction of Chastanet, he's already outlined an approach that he plans to take, and it's an action-oriented approach. So with the recommendations, they will have to be implemented, and if they are toes to be stepped upon, then he will step upon those toes. And I think that people feel that that is how an issue ought to be dealt with. Crime in St Lucia was escalating. I mean, the economy was a greater concern, but there were people who were concerned about crime. And the feeling is that in a situation where you're concerned about crime, it's unfortunate if you are not taking seriously and acting in response to allegations that the people who are responsible for solving crime have themselves been acting in a criminal manner.
Now, Prime Minister Chastanet says he'll be announcing his cabinet soon. Who do you see in this cabinet makeup, beginning with Gail Rigobert?
Yeah, well, definitely Gail Rigobert will be a minister. The question is in which ministry. The one challenge that he has, because in St Lucia the numbers of members of parliament is not large enough that we can expect a huge backbench. Invariably, most of them, if not all of them, become ministers. That's the configuration. Not a very good thing, but that's the way that it tends to work. But he has two challenges. How does he deal with former leader of the opposition, Dr. Gail Rigobert, and how does he deal with Mr. Stephenson King in relation to a future cabinet, remembering that Mr. Stephenson King was a former prime minister? My sense is that he may go, or he would be wise to go the road of former Prime Minister Basil Pandey, who created a kind of a super minister out of Mr. N.R. Robinson, who ultimately came back in his cabinet and served for a time as Minister Extraordinaire. If that is the model that can be followed, then certainly Mr. Stephenson King can fit into that role, which would give Gail Rigobert the opportunity to deal with foreign affairs, which is her specialty. But the sense is that those two individuals need to get ministries that are relatively prominent. There's also a question as to whether or not they will have a deputy prime minister. The SLP had a deputy prime minister. Certainly the UWP has never had a deputy prime minister before. If, however, they do, it has to be one of the deputy leaders, which Mr. King is not. So if a deputy leader is to be appointed, deputy prime minister, then it will probably be either Dr. Rigobert or the other deputy leader of the party, who's not as prominent as she is. So I think that's the real key interest. How will he create a special place for Mr. King at the table? And then also, how will he designate Dr. Rigobert? Will she become St. Lucia's first female deputy prime minister or not?
Now, Mr. Wickham, the St. Lucia Labour Party has lost their second general elections in 10 years. So what happens now for the St. Lucia Labour Party as well as Dr. Anthony?
Well, Dr. Anthony has indicated that he's finished. He said that he will not seek to take up the leadership of the opposition, and he will not seek to take up the leadership of the party. I think this is a wise position for him to take, serve out his time as Vieux South MP, and thereafter, look to exit. I mean, he's not a young person. I think he has been prime minister for long enough that he feels that after 15 years of being in that job, he can look at other things that he can do with his life, and I think that's quite wise. So he's looking to move on. Clearly, I think the question now will be who will take over the St. Lucia Labour Party, and there's keen interest in that regard. There is former Deputy Prime Minister Mr. Philip Pierre, and there's also a gentleman called Dr. Ernest Hilaire. Those are the two faces that people have been looking at to create succession within the St. Lucia Labour Party. And I think that Dr. Anthony has helped considerably by saying, I will step out of the way and allow the party to regenerate and rebuild and prepare itself for the next general election in 5 years.
So St. Lucians have proven that they're a mature electorate, unlike other voters in the Caribbean who keep voting in the same administration despite non-performance. So should Mr. Chastany be on his P's and Q's to avoid a recall in 5 years?
Yeah. No, you're very right, and I do hope that he keeps his ear to the ground. I hope he keeps listening, and I also hope he keeps polling from time to time to see what people are thinking. I mean, there was a clear disconnect that was evident on the ground in St. Lucia that I feel if Dr. Anthony had read it correctly, he could have acted to arrest it. I mean, even up to the point of the election, I felt that he could have arrested the disconnect and started to pursue a line, but there was an indifference to the fact that it was possible that people could actually not like them and not like the UWP and not like him as an individual. And I'm assuming that if Mr. Alan Chastany is wise, he will avoid that possibility of being kicked out immediately, because he realizes that it can happen to him as well, and he will also keep his ear to the ground and keep understanding and listening and speaking to the people and avoid the inclination towards arrogance, one could say.
Thank you very much for sharing your insights with us, Mr. Wickham. That was Pollster Peter Wickham dissecting for us the outcome of the general elections in St. Lucia on Monday.